In the summer of 1947, a British factory worker locked eyes with a man she had been taught to hate since childhood, a man who had worn Hitler's uniform, a man held behind barbed wire less than a mile from her home, and in that moment she unknowingly began a chain of events that would fracture families, bury a newborn child in secrecy, span 2 countries, last more than 70 years, and only be uncovered after death by a DNA test that exposed one of the most forbidden love stories of World War II, a love that was illegal, dangerous, and destined to change everything forever.
Please comment where you are watching from. Let us start. Gwendolyn Chandler was 21 years old and worked as a machinist in a textile factory in Bletchley, Buckinghamshire. Every weekday she left the small terraced house she shared with her parents and younger siblings, mounted her bicycle, and pedaled the same familiar route through quiet English lanes. The road carried her past the county cinema, over a gentle hill, and into the village of Little Brick Hill, a place of trimmed hedges, brick cottages, and lingering wartime scars. At the edge of the village stood a large manor house surrounded by tall trees and iron fencing. Locals no longer called it by its old aristocratic name. It was simply Camp 268. Inside that manor house lived 105 German prisoners of war, men captured during the collapse of the Third Reich and transported to England to work in fields and brickworks while Britain rebuilt itself from ruin. For most villagers, the prisoners were a daily reminder of everything the nation had endured. For 6 years, Britain had fought Germany in a war that killed hundreds of thousands of its sons and daughters. London had burned, Coventry had been flattened. Families had spent nights in shelters listening to bombs tear through neighborhoods. The hatred toward Germany was not abstract, it was carved into living memory. And now, less than 2 years after victory, those same enemies were walking the lanes, harvesting crops, repairing roads, rebuilding a nation they once tried to destroy. The prisoners wore uniforms with colored patches sewn onto their backs so they could be identified at a distance. They were supposed to remain silent toward women. They were forbidden from forming relationships. The British government had issued formal instructions that said prisoners could converse with members of the public, but were not permitted to establish or attempt to establish relations of an amorous or sexual nature. Walking arm in arm was forbidden. Familiar gestures were forbidden. The penalty for disobedience could be imprisonment for the prisoner and public shaming or fines for the woman. One English woman had been fined £1 for giving a German prisoner a slice of cake. That was the climate in which Gwen Chandler found herself falling in love. No one knows exactly how she met Helmut Grell. Perhaps he was working on a nearby farm. Perhaps he spoke to her while she was fixing a chain on her bicycle. Perhaps it began with nothing more than a glance. Helmut was 24 years old, a former Luftwaffe paratrooper captured during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 and held for a year in Camp Butner, North Carolina, before being transferred to England. He was from Bremerford, near Hamburg, and had written letters to his mother about hunger, chaos, and despair in post-war Germany. He spoke enough English to hold a conversation. He was polite, reserved, and desperate for human connection. What began as stolen looks became whispered conversations, then secret meetings hidden from the eyes of villagers who would have destroyed them if discovered. They met in fields, behind hedgerows, along muddy paths at the edge of the woods. They spoke about their childhoods, their fears, the war, and dreams that felt impossible in a broken world. For Gwen, Helmut was no longer the enemy. He was a man trapped by history just as much as she was. But forbidden love always has consequences. By the autumn of 1947, Gwen realized she was pregnant. She tried to hide it. She wore loose clothes. She avoided neighbors. She stopped cycling into the village. But a mother always knows, and eventually her own mother, Lottie, confronted her.
Gwen told the truth. The father was a German prisoner from Camp 268. The news should have shattered the family. Instead, Lottie did something unexpected. She protected her daughter. She arranged for Gwen to be sent away to a church-run home for unmarried mothers in Aylesbury, where she could give birth in secret. The family would protect its reputation and shield Gwen from disgrace. Then, disaster struck. In early April 1948, Helmut Grell and 2 other prisoners were arrested for stealing cigarettes, sweets, and groceries from the village post office. They claimed the items were for their starving mothers in Germany. The magistrate did not care. Helmut was convicted of handling stolen goods and sentenced to 4 months in prison. He was taken away in handcuffs. Gwen never saw him again. On April 16, 1948, Gwen gave birth to a baby boy. He had dark hair and strong features that reminded her of Helmut. She named him Michael John. She held him for 6 weeks. Then she handed him to another family, the Hickmans. No paperwork, no ceremony, just a quiet exchange arranged to make the problem disappear. Gwen went home and never spoke of the child again. And with that, a secret was sealed that would remain buried for more than 70 years. Michael John Hickman grew up believing the Hickman household was the only family he had ever known. He did not suspect that the woman he called mother had not carried him in her body, or that his real mother had once cycled past a prisoner of war camp while hiding a love that Britain would have condemned. His childhood appeared ordinary on the surface. He went to local schools, played football in the streets, and learned early to be self-sufficient in a home where affection was measured rather than abundant. But there were fractures beneath that calm surface, small inconsistencies that never fully made sense but were easy to ignore when one has no reason to question the story given at birth. When Michael was 12 years old, the man he believed was his father, Ronald Hickman, walked out of the house and never returned. No goodbye, no explanation. One evening he was there, and the next he was gone. The silence left behind was heavy and permanent. Years later, as a teenager struggling to understand the absence, his mother, Phyllis, finally told him a story meant to settle the ache. Ronald was not his biological father. His real father, she said, was a famous theater impresario with whom she had once had a secret relationship. The man was wealthy and well-known, unable to acknowledge an illegitimate child without scandal, so the truth had been buried. Michael accepted this explanation because it offered a shape to his confusion, yet something inside him never fully believed it. Decades passed. Michael married, raised children, and eventually moved to France to enjoy a slower life filled with crosswords, wine, and quiet mornings. In 2006, he applied for a French health card and was asked to provide a long birth certificate. The document that arrived was not a standard certificate. It was an entry from the Adopted Children Register. It stated that in 1967 he had been adopted by the very woman he believed to be his biological mother. No explanation was given, no prior notice, just an official record revealing that the foundation of his identity had been quietly rewritten behind closed doors. Michael confronted Phyllis. She offered vague reassurances. She said it was done for legal reasons, to protect him, to ensure Ronald could never return. The answers were foggy, evasive, incomplete. Michael did not pursue it further. He had built a life and did not want to unravel it. In September 2019, he died of pneumonia in a hospital in Poitiers, surrounded by his family, still unaware that he was the child of a forbidden wartime romance. At the funeral, his son Leo felt unsettled by unresolved questions that had haunted his father for decades. Weeks later, Leo received the death certificate from the French authorities. 2 details leapt from the page. The first was the listed birthplace, Aylesbury, Buckinghamshire, a town with no known connection to their family. The second was the father's name, Ronald Hickman, the same man who had abandoned Michael years earlier. Leo knew this could not be right. His father had told him another story, a theater impresario, a hidden affair. The contradictions were now impossible to ignore. Leo contacted the General Register Office in Buckinghamshire. He explained that his father had been born in Aylesbury in 1948, but that there was no trace of him under the name Hickman. The registrar searched the archives and found 4 boys named Michael John born in Aylesbury in that quarter of the year. Only one had the same birth date as Leo's father. That child was named Michael John Chandler, and his record stated that he had been adopted. The certificate arrived days later. The mother was listed as Gwendolyn Chandler, aged 21, occupation machinist, address Little Brick Hill, Buckinghamshire. The father's name was blank. Leo understood immediately what that blank space meant in 1948. His grandmother had been unmarried. His father had been a secret. Using genealogy databases, Leo traced Gwendolyn's life. Born in 1926, worked in a textile factory, married in the 1950s, 2 more children, died young in her mid-40s. She never knew her son had searched for her. She never met her grandchildren. Her secret was carried to the grave. Leo contacted a distant relative named Jill Kent, Gwendolyn's cousin. There was a long silence when Leo explained who he was. Then Jill said something that changed everything. She said she had been waiting for that call her entire life. The family had always known something had happened. A German prisoner of war, she said carefully. That was all she could reveal at first. Leo was stunned. His grandfather was German. Not just German, but a soldier held in England after the war. Jill did not know his name, only that he had been held at Camp 268 in Little Brick Hill. There were 105 prisoners there. Any one of them could have been the man who changed his family's history. Then, Leo remembered a DNA test he had asked his father to take shortly before his death. He logged into the results and saw something he had never expected. 47% Germanic Europe. Nearly half of his father's genetic makeup traced back to northern Germany, specifically the Elbe-Weser Triangle west of Hamburg. Months passed with no breakthrough until late 2021 when a 19-year-old childcare assistant in Hamburg named Melina Michaelinus ordered a discounted DNA test during a Black Friday promotion. 6 weeks later, her results linked her family directly to Leo's father. Melina connected Leo to her mother, Kirsten, who confirmed the relationship through her own DNA test. Kirsten's grandmother was named Emma Grell. She had 10 siblings and dozens of descendants. One of them was Leo's grandfather. Leo now had a surname, Grell, but he still needed the man's first name. Searching through archived newspapers from Little Brick Hill, he found a report dated early April 1948. A German prisoner named Helmut Grell had been convicted of handling stolen goods after being caught with cigarettes, sweets, and groceries from the village post office. The prisoners said they wanted to send the items to their starving mothers in Germany. Helmut Grell was sentenced to 4 months in prison. The name matched, the timing matched, the location matched. Leo contacted the German Red Cross and requested Helmut Grell's prisoner of war capture card. When it arrived, it listed his parents, Joachim Grell and Anna Matthias from Bremerverde, near Hamburg, and recorded that Helmut had been captured during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. The final piece fell into place when Kirsten confirmed that Joachim Grell was Kirsten's grandmother, Emma's brother. Leo had found him. Helmut Grell was his grandfather.
After Leo confirmed the identity of his grandfather, the story that had once lived only in fragments finally began to take shape as a complete human life. Helmut Grell was no longer a shadow hiding behind a blurred photograph or a redacted prison file.
He was a young man who had grown up in the flat farmlands of Lower Saxony, who had played in the streets of Bremerforde before uniforms replaced childhood, who had been drafted into the Luftwaffe Fallschirmjäger and dropped into chaos as the Third Reich collapsed around him. He had survived one of the most brutal winters Europe had ever seen, only to be captured in the forests of the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge and shipped thousands of miles away to a camp in North Carolina, then across the Atlantic again to an English village where he met a woman who would change his bloodline forever. For decades, Helmut never knew that Gwen had carried his child. When he was released from prison in the summer of 1948, he was transferred directly to a repatriation camp and sent back to Germany under the Allied denazification program. The process was clinical and impersonal. Prisoners were graded white, gray, or black, depending on perceived loyalty to the Nazi regime. Helmut, a young paratrooper with no party affiliation, was classified white and released back into a country of ruins. His hometown was unrecognizable. Buildings were hollowed shells. Food was rationed. His mother was frail. His father had aged 10 years in 4. There was no word from England, no letter from Gwen, no knowledge of a child who bore his face. Helmut rebuilt his life with the discipline of a man who had already lost everything once. He found work repairing engines, married a local woman, and raised children who never suspected that their father had once loved an English girl behind hedgerows in Buckinghamshire. The war was spoken of rarely. Shame and exhaustion kept memories sealed. The forbidden romance vanished from spoken history and became instead a hidden current that only DNA would ever trace. Meanwhile, in England, the truth continued to fracture quietly through generations. Gwen Chandler married a railway worker and tried to live a normal life, yet those who knew her said there was always a sadness behind her smile, an absence that could not be explained. Her younger children grew up unaware that they had an older brother somewhere in the world. When Gwen died in 1972, at the age of 46, she carried the knowledge of her first son to the grave. The family assumed it was nothing more than youthful heartbreak. No one asked, no one investigated. Michael Hickman grew old without ever discovering the woman who gave him life. He never held his mother's hand. He never heard the German accent of the father who never knew him. His sense of self was built on a story that was only half true, and it was not until after his death that the fragments were allowed to join. Leo began contacting relatives across Germany. Names that had once been nothing more than faded ink on a Red Cross card now became living voices with laughter, photographs, and questions. He spoke to Helmut's grandchildren, men and women who were stunned to learn that their grandfather had fathered a child in England while a prisoner of war. There was disbelief, then hesitation, then something that surprised everyone: gratitude. They were not ashamed. They were curious. They wanted to know Michael. They wanted to know Gwen. They wanted to understand the story that history had erased. Leo visited Bremerforde and stood outside the house where Helmut had grown up. He walked the same roads his grandfather had walked as a boy, hearing the same birds, breathing the same damp northern air. He imagined Helmut writing letters to his mother from England, describing hunger and fear while hiding the truth of the woman he loved. He imagined the pain of returning home with nothing, unaware that a son existed across the sea. The realization struck Leo with unexpected force. The war had not ended in 1945. It had simply changed shape. It had continued inside families, inside silences, inside missing names on birth certificates. It had reached across decades to touch a man in France who only wanted to know who his father truly was. And then there was the final question, the one no document could answer. Had Gwen and Helmut ever tried to find each other again? Leo searched British court archives, prison transfer records, and local parish files. There was no trace of letters, no petitions, no appeals. Helmut had been removed from England while Gwen was still recovering from childbirth in Aylesbury. By the time she returned home, he was already gone. In 1948, there was no email, no social media, no international tracing service for lovers separated by governments. A single arrest had erased a future. The cruelty of it was simple. Two people had broken an unwritten rule during a moment of rebuilding and had paid for it with an entire lifetime apart. For Leo, the story was no longer about the mystery of his grandfather. It was about the cost of silence, the way societies choose convenience over compassion, and the quiet devastation created when love becomes illegal. And yet, despite everything, Helmut Grell was no longer lost. He had a name again. He had a grandson who carried his blood, and his story was finally being told.
The discovery of Helmut Grell did not bring closure. It opened a door that had been sealed by history and revealed how many lives had been quietly shaped by a single hidden pregnancy in 1948. Leo began to realize that the story was not only about a lost grandfather, but about an entire generation taught to survive through silence. He contacted British historians who specialized in prisoner of war camps and learned that Camp 268 in Little Brick Hill was one of dozens of similar camps scattered across the country, housing more than 400,000 German prisoners at the peak of post-war reconstruction. They worked in agriculture, forestry, brickmaking, and road repair. Britain depended on them, yet officially treated them as a threat to moral order. The restrictions placed on prisoners were severe. They could attend church, play football, and write censored letters home, but they could not form romantic attachments. The policy was enforced unevenly, often with cruelty. Some women were dragged before magistrates for nothing more than smiling at a prisoner. Others were fired from factories for suspected impropriety. The goal was not discipline, it was deterrence. The government feared that if relationships were normalized, the public would no longer view former enemies as enemies at all. In this climate, Gwen Chandler's pregnancy was not only a personal scandal, it was a political embarrassment. The local authorities had every incentive to make it disappear quietly. A young machinist sent away to a home for unmarried mothers left no ripples in official records. A baby handed to another family required no public explanation. A German prisoner convicted of petty theft could be removed from the country without questions. The system did not conspire in secret, it simply followed its own rules. Leo searched for anyone who might have known Gwen personally. He spoke to neighbors who remembered her as a kind but withdrawn woman. They recalled that after 1948, she was never quite the same. She laughed less. She attended fewer social events. She avoided the lanes that led past the manor house. No one connected it to a lost child. In Britain at the time, unmarried mothers were expected to disappear and return as if nothing had happened. Memory itself became another casualty of war. In Germany, Helmut's children were grappling with their own revelations. His daughter Sabine described him as gentle, hard-working, and emotionally distant. He never spoke about England. He never mentioned a woman named Gwendolen. Yet after his death in the 1990s, his family found letters written in careful English, tucked inside an old toolbox, addressed only to "my dearest friend." The letters were never sent. They spoke of regret, loneliness, and the belief that something precious had been stolen from him by forces beyond his control. The parallels were painful. Gwen and Helmut had both lived full lives and yet carried the same absence. Each had protected their families by burying the truth, believing that silence was an act of love.
Their children grew up unaware that their bloodlines crossed the North Sea during a season when crossing emotional boundaries was more dangerous than crossing national ones. Leo arranged a video call between his German relatives and the English side of his family. Faces appeared on screens, mirroring each other in shape, eyes, and expressions that no history book could deny. People laughed through tears as they pointed out shared features. It was the first time since 1947 that the two halves of Helmut and Gwen's family existed in the same moment. For Leo, the experience was overwhelming. He was no longer the keeper of a secret, but the bridge between worlds that had once been forbidden to touch. He imagined his grandmother, Gwen, standing at the gate of Camp 268, watching Helmut disappear into the back of a truck, unaware that she carried his child and that their love would not die, but go dormant for generations. The British public often speaks of victory in World War II as a clean moral triumph, yet stories like this reveal a more complicated truth. Wars do not end when treaties are signed. They linger in birth records, in censored letters, in the children who grow up without names for half their heritage. Leo returned to Little Brick Hill and stood outside the manor house where Camp 268 once operated. The barbed wire was gone. The guards were gone. Only a quiet estate remained, owned by people who had no idea what had unfolded on that ground. He placed his hand on the cold stone wall and whispered his grandfather's name. Helmut Grell had finally come home. The story did not end with a name on a capture card or a family video call across borders. It ended in something far more fragile and powerful, the slow rewriting of a family history that had been built on silence for more than 70 years. Leo began compiling everything he had learned into a record that his own children would inherit, not as a tale of scandal, but as proof that even in the aftermath of the most destructive war in human history, ordinary people still found ways to love. He returned again to Aylesbury, to the same town where his father had been born and quietly removed from his mother's arms 6 weeks later. The home for unmarried mothers no longer existed. In its place stood a modern housing development with identical doors and trimmed hedges. There was no plaque, no recognition of the hundreds of women who had passed through those walls, carrying children conceived in secrecy and fear. Leo stood there for several minutes, imagining Gwen holding her newborn son one last time before surrendering him to a future that would erase her. From Aylesbury, he traveled to Bremervoord to meet Helmut's surviving children in person. They welcomed him with the warmth of people who felt that something broken had been repaired. Old photo albums were placed on the table. A young Helmut stared out from black and white prints, eyes bright, uniform crisp, a boy trying to look like a man. Leo recognized the same gaze he had seen in his father's face all his life. The resemblance was undeniable. They spoke openly about the war, about what Helmut had endured, about the long years of rebuilding in a defeated country. His German relatives described how Helmut never raised his voice, never complained, and never allowed himself indulgence. It was as if part of him had remained behind the barbed wire of an English camp, still waiting for a life that never came. For Leo, the final step was symbolic. He submitted paperwork to have Helmut Grell's name added to his father's family tree in official records, not as a rumor or a footnote, but as a fact. It was a quiet act of justice that no court had ever provided in 1948. The world has changed since Gwen Chandler cycled past Camp 268. Today, people trace ancestry with saliva samples and digital databases. Borders no longer silence bloodlines. What once required courage and secrecy now requires only curiosity. Yet Leo understands that technology did not create this reunion, it only revealed what had always existed. His grandfather was not a villain. His grandmother was not reckless. They were two young people who met at the wrong moment in history and paid with a lifetime apart. Their love did not survive in photographs or letters. It survived in chromosomes, passed invisibly from a machinist in Buckinghamshire to a paratrooper from Lower Saxony and into a man who would spend decades searching for a truth that had been hidden before he could speak. Leo tells this story now so that his children will never inherit silence. He wants them to know that families are not only shaped by weddings and certificates, but by the choices people make when no one is watching and when society tells them they are wrong for loving the person in front of them. Helmut Grell never met his son. Gwendoline Chandler never knew her grandson. But their blood met again across 3 generations, carried not by memory, but by biology, by the stubborn refusal of life to be erased by war or law or fear. And that is how a forbidden love story from 1947 finally found its ending in the 21st century, not in tragedy, but in truth.